Welcome everyone to Southport Room, day 2. It's about to kick off. I do have a couple of messages I did want to kind of say here before I welcome our good friend Nigel up to the stage. So I did want to respectfully acknowledge the people of the Yugambeh language region, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and those emerging. I would particularly like to acknowledge my wife and her family who are descendants of this land and thank them for all they have taught me about their culture and extend my respect to any First Nations peoples here today. So I've been asking ChatGPT to write me up a little bio around our speakers yesterday and then through to today as well. So before I welcome Nigel Phair, who will be talking about cybercrime in Australia for the last 20 years of inaction, he is a cyber guru who defends networks with a bow tie, floppy disks, and a touch of retro magic. His unique methods of techno-juggling skills keep hackers on their toes and the cyber world entertained. Can we give a warm round of applause for Nigel Phair?
I like it. Like that? Thanks, mate. Yeah. And here I thought ChatGPT was a good thing. All right. Thanks, Lucas. Great to be here. I thought today, for today's presentation, as per the intro and as per the conference theme, we do a bit of a retrospective look of law enforcement. So my background, the little bit that ChatGPT didn't pick up on, I don't own a bow. Actually, I probably do own a bow tie somewhere. But I used to be in the police. I spent many years in the Australian Federal Police, 21 years. And considering we're at the Back to the Future theme for this conference, I thought, why not just have a look back at how we've gone? So if I wind that clock back to 2002, I was in Canberra. I was a police detective in the Australian Federal Police working, actually, as of today, Bali bombings hadn't happened, but in late 2002, I think it was about September, October from memory, the Bali bombings happened. Unfortunately, they put every investigative resource into that. So I was busily working away with that. As time went on, we're getting towards the end of 2002, and my very good friend who I joined the police with and did recruit training with, a guy called Alistair McGibbon, one or two of you might have heard of him, comes back from a 3-year secondment to the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC. And we're having a cup of coffee. I hadn't seen him in 3 years. Very good friend of mine, all the way, as I said, we joined together in 1989, so some years ago. I was a very young recruit. Might have been 14 or so. They made special allowance for me. So he said to me, the commissioner has asked me to set up this body called high-tech crime. I said, that's awesome. And he said, we're putting it together. I need someone to lead the investigations. I said, great. He said, will you do it? And I said, absolutely, I'd love to do it. He said, right, we're starting straight away. And there was 4 of us. I said, awesome. So I moved off doing counter-terrorism investigations post-Bali. And I said, I've got one question. He said, what's that? And I said, what's high-tech crime? He goes, I don't know, but we'll work it out. So that's the basis of what I'm going to talk about. And there's going to be plenty of time for questions. So as we go down that memory lane. So what did we do and how did we do it? What's happened since then is really what I'm going to be talking about. So we did have a crack at it. It's still late 2002. Started off with 4 of us, and it grew rapidly. We got secondees from each state and territory police because we didn't know. Because this is the whole thing. The word cyber really wasn't. Cyber meant different things back then. We were talking about high-tech crime, so we called ourselves the Australian High-Tech Crime Centre, and we borrowed everything from the Brits. And my first thesis of this is the UK were at least half a dozen years in front of us back in 2002. Today they are still at least half a dozen years in front of us. And I'm going to talk a bit about why I think that to be the case. In their public policy, in their thinking, in their law enforcement, in everything when it comes to the cybers. So the UK had created in 2001 a body called the National High-Tech Crime Unit, NHTCU. They were HI-TECH, we were HIGH-TECH. We'd like to think we're properer with our English. Because they do program with a double ME too, so they're a little bit weird. So we had secondees from state and territories. We had secondees from then the Defence Signals Directorate to give us our technical ability, because we didn't have it. Secondees from ASIC, secondees from Customs, from the ACMA. I'm trying to think where else. They were probably the main, and the Bureau of Stats. So we went to all the government agencies and said, you guys need to get on board, and they went, we're on board. They all sent us a secondee. So the first lesson in life for anyone that's either been a secondee or had secondees, organisations either send their very best people because it's a great opportunity for them to grow and learn and work with another organisation, or they send their very worst people. We got both. We'll park that to one side. We moved the dial forward to April 2003, and we're sitting at work, everything's going great, and we get a phone call from the Commonwealth Bank. It was our first phishing investigation that we did. Dodgy looking Commonwealth Bank email. And we were pretty early, Australia, with phishing, and from a law enforcement perspective. South America were doing some things before us as a continent. US, as in North America, were doing nothing. Europe were doing nothing. That changed pretty rapidly, of course. So we get this investigation, we go to Sydney, we find the perpetrator, we lock him up. He's a Russian. Who would have thought? Then that was April 2003, and then phishing just takes off. Middle of the year, about July 2003, I actually went to Moscow, which was really interesting. That's a chat for alcohol. But I had a good week there with an organisation called Department K, which is what they then called their cybercrime unit, their high-tech crime unit. So we had a good week. We did no work, but we had a good week. That's why we need the alcohol. Anyway, time went on and time went on. I did that job for about 5 years and leading investigations, and I went off and did a whole lot of other stuff. Anyway, they ended up closing the Australian High-Tech Crime Centre down for various reasons, most of which I thought were pretty dodgy. But anyway, we'll catch up to where we are in the current state. So 2001 was when cybercrime legislation properly came out in Australia. We had some various acts before then. They were more state and territory computer misuse acts. Remember, computer was the terminology of the day. If you look at the Cybercrime Act 2001, it has the word computer all the way through it, because that's what we were looking at, computers. So, those big clunky bits of plastic on your desk with that thing that whirred around in the middle, and your monitor was sort of like deeper that way than wider that way, and you thought you were pretty cool. And we did a lot of forensics. We did a lot of, when you look back at a lot of basics forensics, but we did forensics. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting on the 20th anniversary in 2021 to do a retrospective look of how we've gone policing cybercrime. So if you've got a Kindle and you're on the Kindle Unlimited, the library one, it's a free download for you if you want to have a look at it. So I did a lot of, so other academics have looked into this. From various universities, done some surveys. I did a lot of surveys. I surveyed police, I surveyed industry professionals, I surveyed all sorts of people. I did a lot of freedom of information requests. And so my first problem I hit was the ACSC. So the Australian Cyber Security Centre, which is part of the Australian Signals Directorate, is a non-FOIable organisation because they're part of the defence infrastructure. So I think that's our first problem, is if we're going to have an out there, and I love the ACSC, by the way, I think they're going great guns. They're still not up to the, as I talk up to the Brits again, the NCSC. For anyone that wants, I think, good, solid advice to give to people, tell them to follow the NCSC on the socials. They're always putting out really good, solid advice. Whether it's on passwords, whether it's on protecting devices and everything, I think it's simple and it's to the point and it's really relevant. So I couldn't get a whole lot of data from the ACSC. They're an outward-facing organisation. I think they should be an FOIable organisation because we don't know what they do and how they do it. So I did a cost of cybercrime model and I came up with a whole lot of indices because there's a whole lot of vendors out there, as you know, that say ransomware costs us this and phishing costs us that and business email costs us whatever and blah, blah, blah. So I put it all into a washing machine and spat out 2% of GDP. $42 billion is the cost of cybercrime. One of my goals in life would be to get an economist that's really interested in this and do a big piece of work on costing out cybercrime. Because one of the problems I think we have is we've got data breaches, and an organisation goes, yes, I must do something. But if you can quantify that cost, really quantify the cost, not come up with semi-rubbery figures like I have, I think it would be a really powerful thing to do. Also, all my surveys told me that cybercrime is underreported anywhere between 5 and 10 times. So I went back and went 5 times, and that's how I get my 300,000 instances. And then I looked at the law enforcement perspective, because matters, there's lots of legal journals out there, and when matters go to court, the majority of them get published in legal journals in one way, shape or form. So I went back and looked at all the matters that we've done, and I estimate law enforcement across Australia, so that state and territory police and the federal police, finalise around 10 matters a year. So we're not doing so well now. And when I look at some of the things that are out there now, you might have heard of a thing called the AC3E. And that's the Australian Cyber something, something, something. It's in Sydney, you can Google it, or put it in ChatGPT. You can, and that is the federal police are not having a big body of area with seconded state and territory police. And what I laugh about all these things is there was a big ministerial announcement and they're saying we're going to put all these police together and we're going to solve cybercrime, as we hear the minister says, and she says, calls them scumbags and all these other things. But we did that in 2003. And so I love how people forget about history. They all think, oh, this is a new innovation. We've never done this before. We've never had police working together. So that's where we come from. That's just one of the instances. So what's the government telling us? So 2 seminal pieces of information we're getting from the government. From the ACSC, a cybercrime is now reported every 7 minutes. Again, I'm estimating that's about 1/5 of the actual matters, down from 1 every 8 minutes. I suppose next year we'll be down to 1 every 6 minutes, and at some stage we're going to be down to a report per minute. Now, I have a lot of issues, and I don't know about anyone else. I'm happy to take questions later. I think it's really difficult to report a cybercrime. I've spoken to a lot of organisations that go, where do I report? The police? Because the police won't take a report. You've got to go to Report Cyber, ACORN before that. And the problem I find when you go through the workflow of Report Cyber is there's an assumption you know what you're talking about. And if you're a small or medium business and you don't have technical expertise available, you just know something has happened. You've either lost money, could be business email compromise, or you can't get into your network because it could be ransomware. But a lot of those people, when you actually get down to the tin tacks, don't know that stuff. I was in this venue earlier this year talking to the Terry White Chenmart Chemist National Conference. And another fun fact I didn't know, and I've been to this venue a lot of times, underneath the casino is a big conference area, big theaterette that takes about 400 people. So I was down there talking to owners and operators of 600 chemists. And that's what gives you the reality check about how clueless a lot of businesses are out there when it comes to any form of protecting themselves online. That's the reality check when you're talking to these people afterwards and they go, I still don't know what multi-factor authentication is. You mentioned that thing. What is it? It's like, Jesus. Anyway. So what's the government telling us? Badness online, and of course the other big one from the ACCC, that just came out, 3.1 billion in reported scams. That's a lot of money. So we're not, back when I was doing it 20 years ago when we started, we weren't doing so well. We weren't doing so well in the middle, we're still not doing so well. There's a lot of we're not doing so well. So because we're at AusCERT, and I love the AusCERT people and the AusCERT conference, some of you may or may not be aware that AusCERT used to do a survey. So the Computer Crime and Security Survey, the methodology was borrowed from what was then known as the FBI/CSI or something, Computer Crime and Security Survey. So we used to work with them, and I'm hoping you can see the stats. So you can see there, 2003 through to 2006. I think the survey started in 2002. You'll be struggling to find this resource online. If you want the surveys in detail, you'd probably have to ask the AusCERT people. I actually did a lot of Googling and couldn't find it. I just had this elsewhere. So 20 years ago, surveys were being taken place. Did your organisation experience one or more electronic attacks? Again, we didn't talk cyber back then. We're assuming they're accurate. They had a survey response of about the 250 to 300 odd mark back then of organisations. So we're looking here at close to half said yes and a bit more than half said no and a whole lot said don't know. So I think that's interesting. If we look at the amount of organisations, we could say maybe things have changed, maybe things haven't. The next one, and again, I'm hoping the resolution is kind of there. You probably can't see all the stuff on the left. What aspects of computer security? Remember, as I mentioned in my intro, the word computer was everywhere. That's what we remembering when we started in the High Tech Crime Centre, there was no Apple iPhones, there was no social media, there was none of that sort of stuff. So we're very much the nomenclature of computers. Laptops, we spent a fortune on laptops, and they're pretty clunky, but anyway. So that's, if you can read it, that gives you some vignettes of the sorts of things that organisations were facing. And again, when we have some questions shortly, we can discuss, debate, I'm happy to talk afterwards about whether they're still the risk today. Probably yes would be my answer. So it would be interesting if we replicated this survey across the board today, whether these things change. Whether organisations, for example, still struggle with, if you look at the third one down, which is the biggest one, between 80 and 85%, changing personnel attitudes and behaviour regarding computer security practices. Be interesting for you all to dwell on your own experience, whether that would be still 80% in your organisations. The ones I've worked in, and I come out of universities, I think the answer would be yes. The old chestnut of how much do we spend? Has your organisation increased expenditure on computer security? Good news is, though, people were spending more. Bad news is there was 1% they didn't know. That's probably not so good. That's probably one person. That might have been Lucas. Sorry, mate. So I think these figures are interesting. And I said, it would be good to redo these surveys. I think it would be, because if they're exactly the same, I think I'd be even more depressed. I haven't got too many more of these. And these surveys are quite extensive. I said, if you can find the artefacts online, there's a lot in it. I've only picked a few sessions, a few graphs, only because I think they're really relevant to looking at how we've gone over time. So this is the big one. And this really comes down to, do organisations really know if they've suffered, in this parlance, an electronic attack, or we might say in our current time, a cyber attack? Doesn't go into the detail of what they did. So, what did they do? And this goes back to my law enforcement issue. So the vast majority chose not to report one or more incidents to anyone outside the organisation. I think that's really interesting. Back then, I'd love to know how many people don't report now. Going back to my complaints of report cyber, one of my other beefs with police is that because you can't report matters to police, is they want you to go through the report cyber. I get it from a perspective of getting all the information, but if something else happens to you in life, you go to the police to report it if you've been wronged by some way, if your car gets broken into, your bag stolen. I still think we need that parlance online. I'm a big believer of online being no different to offline with the things that we do. So the vast majority chose not to report. I'd argue, and I'm going to talk about notifiable data breaches shortly, the vast majority of people probably still choose not to report. So we've got some civil matters there. We've got some reporting to AusCERT, because that was probably outside of police about one of the only few places you could report matters to get something happening there. And of course, a few reported to us. We did in the Australian High Tech Crime Centre have an online reporting functionality. That's one of the first things that we did. We took it down after about 12 months when we realised we were pretty much getting all these reports and doing nothing with them. So where are we up to? While we're looking at stats for the ASA members here, I think, has anyone read the ASA response to the cyber strategy. I actually think it's a really good response. I say that because I'm an ASA member firstly, and secondly, because I actually think it's a really good response. It's a long response, but I think they've got some really good vignettes in there. And I don't know if you can, you definitely can't read that. I can't read it from here. And it's basically, the question is, would expanding the existing regime for notification of cybersecurity incidents, e.g. to require mandatory reporting of ransomware and extortion demands, improve public understanding? So 80% are saying yes. So this is the ASA survey of their members. For those of you that are ASA members, you would have got an email asking you to respond to a survey. So I find reporting really interesting. You've got Minister O'Neill talking a lot about reporting of cybercrime. She's even gone as far as to say we should ban ransomware payments, make it illegal. That's a big step. I'm a believer we shouldn't pay them. I'm not a believer of banning anything online, by the way. So here we are saying the ASA membership are saying 80% of them that responded to the ASA survey for the submission to the strategy are saying they think we should have mandatory reporting of cybercrime. Something to think about, something to unpack. I think we should have mandatory reporting. How you police that is another discussion. So if we recap where we're going, we've got some reporting, we've got some people over history who've known what's gone on. Where are we up to now? Going back to our AusCERT 4 years in a row of surveys. So I mentioned earlier on that I estimate police finalise 10 matters a year. This is from between, call it 20 and 15 years ago, what organisations said were happening when they reported a matter. So when matters were reported to police, this is what they said on their survey. About 1 in 5 allegation was not investigated. Next one down, investigated but inadequate legislation. I think that's a cop-out. We have a lot of legislation. You've also probably heard the Minister talk about a new Cybercrime Act, a cover-all act. If there's one thing in my view we don't need is more legislation. We have so much cyber-related legislation that's not used, it's amazing. We do not need another one or another act which will weave its way through Parliament for eons and eons and really achieve nothing for us. Investigation but lack of evidence prevented a charge. If I look at my own reflections of 5 years back then of investigating cybercrime, we'd get a call from an organisation and say something's happened. We'd go out there to work out what this something was, and the first question we'd ask is say, so where are your logs? And they go, what logs? Organisations just didn't log. So many of them didn't log. Or they logged and it was maybe more for performance issues, and so they burnt the logs every 24 hours. That's life. If we haven't got logs to follow IP addresses, etc., we came to dead ends pretty quickly. So international issues, 5%. I think that's a big misnomer. We hear a lot about, oh, the cyber criminals are all overseas, it's too hard. They're in jurisdictions we can't touch. I think that's completely wrong. Some are in jurisdictions we can't touch. Lots are in Australia. Lots are in jurisdictions we can touch. So there's lots of excuses about why not to do something in law enforcement land. So where are we going to take this next? I think the first thing we need to do, just following from what I said, is work out who the crooks are and what do they do. So we've been doing some research. A guy called Jonathan Lusthouse. He does a nice newsletter once a quarter if you want to follow it. So chucks it out on email. Did his PhD and wrote a book on what's called the human geography of cybercrime. He went all through Eastern Europe, all through Asia, and interviewed lots of cyber criminals to work out where they actually are. And we've then done some more work with that when I was at UNSW with Jono, and he's at Oxford University. And we're trying to work out answer this question, instead of saying, oh, look, the crooks, they're in Russia, and they're in Iran, and they're in North Korea, and they're in China, and that's it. Actually, where are they? And what do they do? Do they actually ever get together? A lot of our hypotheses way back when we started the Australian High-Tech Crime Centre was criminals don't need to talk to each other. They can use encrypted chat, be geographically based all over the place. And I think we largely got that wrong because we were making stuff up. And that's what we're trying to do with this project. It's a multi-year project, is actually work out where the cyber criminals are based. And the reason I'm so interested in working out where they're based and where they actually physically get together like a good business does, and how they manage themselves as a serious and organised criminal group, is this project will come up in probably about another 18 months to 2 years' time. The idea is to come up with a basket of measures. And we might think to ourselves, how do we work out where the cyber criminals are, but how do we work out where the next cyber criminals will be? If I go back to my early career in policing, I spent the first 7 years doing drug investigations. Lots of work's been done on drug interdiction. Lots of work has been done, and unsuccessfully, as we probably know, lots of work is done on drug diversion. I think we need to do a lot of work on diverting potential cyber criminals. Guess who's doing this? The Brits. They've had programs for years going into schools, trying to work out who's likely to become a cyber criminal, diverting them as they start getting a bit wobbly and get them on the right path to being, to use the nomenclature, a white hat type person. So the whole idea of this project, which is so interesting, is we think about things like, oh, well, a jurisdiction might have a really good school and mathematics system, they might have really good internet capability, they might have really poor governance and law enforcement, they might be high unemployment. What are these things that forces people or makes them more a predilection to become cyber criminals? Again, lots of supposition. We're trying to put a minuscule amount of evidence behind that. And where I'd like to get to is present it to the Australian government, in fact all governments, and say, we do all this work in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, all these places we do training courses, we do all this half-baked stuff. We think on our indices, country X is going to be the next place where there's going to be cyber criminals. We need to put this program in place to help them. Helps them as a nation, helps us as a nation because they might attack us as cyber criminals. That's the big body of work and the big thing that interests me, that we're still not fully getting our hand on. We're being very reactionary. We're very much, oh, we need more police to do this. All right, there's not too many more stats to go. Again, back to our survey. Insider attacks. Another one of my favourite soapboxes, and I should tell you, I've got soapboxes lined up over to the beach. This session finishes about 2, doesn't it, Lucas? I'll get through half of them, just jokes. Insider attacks. So why is this interesting? I find it interesting because if we look at the stats, and as the great Steve Waugh said, stats never lie. 2003 to 2006, we had a lot of organisations experiencing insider attacks. About a third, if we add them all up. Third to a half experiencing insider attack. So we think about, okay, that's interesting. The reality is we know some of our staff either do mischievous things and some of them do criminal things. Some of them somewhere in the middle. That's just like, if there's one thing I think we can tackle in society, really tackle in society, it's insiders. I think that's the low-hanging fruit. So this is from then, this is from now. So the Australian Office of the Information Commissioner puts out every 6 months their data breach statistics. Now, I'm not a big fan of the notifiable data breach scheme, and the reason is, when I did some freedom of information requests on the Privacy Commissioner, back in 2021, so a couple of years ago now, anyone want to hazard a guess how many own motion investigations the Privacy Commissioner had commenced? And this has been going around now for 5 years, so then it's been going around for about 3.5. Anyone want to chuck a number out? Gary, 0? No, they're better than that. 10? No. 2? Oh, don't steal my thunder, Gary. You'll be correct then. So 4. Commenced 4 own motion investigations, concluded 1, which was the Uber data breach, if you remember that. And to Gary's point, 0. So the Privacy Commissioner has at her disposal personal fines, corporate fines, and enforceable undertakings, none of them being used. So when I go back to my complaint about legislation, we have so much legislation that's not used. So, insider attacks. The whole purpose of this point is, if you look at this, every 6 months is identical. Health is the number one sector. Inside, the number of reported breaches, reported breaches per day, about the same. Insiders is the interesting one. So we've got about half being malicious and about a third being human error. Again, nothing has changed since 2003 to 2006. Here we are in 2018 to 2021. Nothing has changed when it comes to this sort of stuff. So a couple of things before we rip through. Cyber insurance, when I start looking at my next lot of market failures, so we've got failure from go to woe of 20 years, in my view. It's as simple as that. I think cyber insurance is another market failure, or put it this way, hasn't been a market success. Again, if you can read the stats in the bottom right-hand corner, they're from the ASA submission to the cybersecurity strategy. These ones here, does your organisation have cyber insurance? I think it's amazing, it's only 60%. I thought the figure was much higher than 60%. Most organisations I talk to have it, but obviously I'm wrong. It is only 60% have cyber insurance. If you look at some of the stats from the Marsh survey at the top, cyber insurance premiums are going through the roof. And we have very little jurisprudence, very little case law. For those that are the train spotters out there, you can put into ChatGPT and say Inchcape Australia and Chubb Insurance Australia. It's a really good little case study. Essentially, Inchcape Australia, they're car importers, Suzuki et al. They had a cybercrime matter, had a I think it was a ransomware. Quite sure it was a ransomware. Anyway, they had some problems. They rebuilt their systems, but they didn't just rebuild them back to the same state. They rebuilt them back to a better state. They went to Chubb as their insurance policy and said, can you please pay us some money? They went, no. Went through the federal court and Chubb won because the insurance policy said, we're only going to pay you the bill back to your the current state that you had. And Inchcape was saying, well, that was obviously a pretty poor current state because we got done over. So we build it back to have a better security posture. Surely that's a smarter thing to do. Court didn't agree with that. Skill shortage, another no-brainer. We've got to do something with the skills. Depending which survey you read, depending on which statistic you want to pull out of there. What do we do about getting more people into the industry? It's probably a whole session in itself. We need to do something. I come out of the higher education sector. We have bachelors, we have masters, we do all sorts of professional education. There's lots of certifications. I think we need on a page what the pathway it means to go through your cyber career and where you enter and where you exit. Not everyone needs to do a bachelor. Don't tell my Vice-Chancellor I said that. Some people can enter it different ways. Some people are, industry certification is more their thing rather than a bachelor or a master's. For some people, they just might want to be self-taught. Some people might want to use free labs. I think we need to, everything needs to be on the table. We need to encourage much more mid-career people, much more younger people. We need a whole lot of everything, I think is the answer. So, before we have some time for some questions, what are we going to do about it? Well, the first thing we're going to do about it, I think, is all of us are responsible. We all need to be security leaders in all our shapes of lives, whether it's our organisations, whether you're a member of a social club, your friends and your family, whatever instance or wherever you are, we need to be the champions. We need to be helping people. We need to stop that $3.1 billion in scams going to 4.1 next year. Because guess what? It'll be at 4 billion next year. I think the next thing we need to do, and the media is mainly responsible for this, is don't blame victims. Too many times I come to a conference, and I don't know if it's been said this week, too many times I go to a conference, people say, people are our weakest link. I've talked about insiders. I've talked about how nothing's changed about insiders and how I think we can really do it. We really need to empower our people. We need to stop victim blaming them if something happens. We need to flip that around and say, you know what, people? You're our strongest part of it. There's no technical silver bullet here. People are going to solve this problem. So we need to change the discussion and stop saying people are our weakest link and they're our eyes and our ears and our everything. And of course, it all comes back to risk. So, Lucas, we got time for questions? I know that you don't have many minutes left.
Yeah, we've got plenty of time.
Questions?
There is one question online,
Okay.
you, through the app. Love that you brought up insider threats. How do we get organisations to take these more seriously as opposed to being so overly focused on the external threats?
Yeah, and that's my thesis, I think, really. I think going back to my last dot point on that last one, being a risk-aware organisation, a risk assessment on a body of evidence should tell you, just looking at the slide alone from the notifiable data breach scheme, that a third of our data breaches come from insiders. And if you get under the hood of what the Privacy Commission puts out, there's people that have said that they've been a data breach of serious harm, and that's the threshold to report. It must be serious harm, of which there's no definition, by the way, of serious harm. So the lawyers out there love stuff without definitions. Where people have put the email address in the CC rather than the BC. So when you think about staff training and awareness and education, then we know there's a ton of awareness programs out there, some good, some intermediate, and some better. That's a really simple win that you could solve just by that CC, BCC. So I think doing simple things is the answer, like that.
All right, thank you. Gary?
Nigel, what do you reckon those stats would be if people had to report business data breaches rather than just personal data breaches?
Ooh, jeez, it's a good one, Gary. I don't know. Lots. Is that a sufficient answer? Well, I suppose if we wind the question back, I don't know how many organisations, if they suffered a business data breach, how many they know when they know it's happened or how it's happened. And this is where, when you look at some of the big data breaches, you look at Optus, you look at Medibank, and you look at Latitude. I say this through gritted teeth. I have a modicum of sympathy for the people in those organisations, because the media is saying, tell me how many and tell me how many now. You've got politicians like Clara now saying, tell me how many and how many now. They don't know. They've got to do an investigation. It's going to take days, weeks, months. So for the people in those organisations, tough gig. I don't know. Someone's got to ask me a simpler question.
Do we have any simple questions in the room?
Do we want to talk about the NBA then? The Heat play today.
Hey Nigel, Jonathan from Bupa. You're at a university and you talk about the skills shortage. Have you got any insight on what unis are doing to bridge that gap moving forward?
Not enough. So historically, universities like international students because they kind of pay a lot more. So that's a focus of theirs. Universities traditionally focus on programs that they've always focused on rather than being nimble and going, oh, we need to try something else. So I'm at Monash, and Monash is great. We have a very successful Bachelor of IT. Very high ATAR, very high waiting list. All our Commonwealth supported placements are taken up by that. So when I go and say, we need a Bachelor of Cyber Security, they say, I've got a Bachelor of IT. So the first discussion is, they're chalk and cheese. And they go, well, can't we just put something in there? Can't we have an elective, a cyber elective? And I go, well, we can, but that's not going to solve the problem. And then we get to the discussion, well, we are going to have a Bachelor of Cyber Security, by the way. We've got to design it. We've got to get industry support to design it. But then the next issue is we actually don't have any Commonwealth supported places for it. So we can only accept full fee paying people on it. So stuff is trying to happen, but there's friction at every point, which is disappointing.
Just on that vein on skills, there is a question online. Where are we, nation or individual key organisations, in developing the skill pathway you mentioned under the skills shortage area?
Well, I think there's a few organisations and a few people, I think there's quite a lot of people thinking about it and looking at it. I don't think we're very far advanced because there's a lot of disagreement. If we look at, let's look at pen testing, for example. If we look at the techie sort of stuff, you've got some people that'll say, I chair the CREST chapter here in Australia. So I love CREST certifications. I also like offensive security. I also like SANS. And then there's some people who say, but what about EC Council? They should be up there. And some will say, maybe, maybe not. So I think we've got to get there's a lot of discussion. I'd like to, again, back to my point, I'd like to see on a page a pathway, maybe not snakes and ladders, but some sort of way that people can sort of see what a certification means. An undergraduate degree is a big deal. It's 3 years of your life. You learn a lot. You get to go and play in the sporting team. You get to watch the bands on campus. There's a whole thing around that. We've got to appreciate that for what it is. But it's a completely different experience to going and doing a 1-week boot camp and smashing out a certification. They're both really important at different phases of your career. I just don't think people coming into it, many of us here that have been around a long time have got an idea where things sit, and then you've got a master's or a graduate certificate and all these things. I just like to set that on a page. And equivalency is probably not the word, but banding. Banding's through this so that you can say, I'm at this band.
Yeah, thank you. And us at Seek, we have been exploring what's called a engineering growth framework. It's mainly targeted for software engineers and trying to adapt that through to what cybersecurity looks like as well for our inside people.
Well, secure code comes into that, of course. DevSecOps. Yep.
So I'll read the question verbatim. When Indian police won't help with prosecuting, according to Scammer Paycheck, what hope do we have fighting back? I think it might be more of a jurisdictional kind of question.
It is a jurisdiction. So the hope that we have of fighting back is law enforcement to law enforcement support, training and effort. It is obviously getting those jurisdictions to give a damn, and that's geopolitical. And it's hard because imagine being the Australian police and in this instance, say the Indian police come and say, come and do this investigation for us. And the cops here going, geez, we're swamped with our own stuff. Why would we help you? So there needs to be some reciprocity going on. Don't think Interpol is a saviour. You've watched too many movies. Interpol actually doesn't do anything. It's just a conduit for sharing of information. But the jurisdictional thing is difficult. I don't shy away from it.
Yeah, cool.
But not impossible. That's the issue, not impossible.
Excellent, thank you. We do have a ton of more questions online. Are you around for the rest of the day?
I am around. You can have a chat after this. Hit me up on LinkedIn and connect that way. And happy to talk to people. And
Fantastic. You're a tall guy, so you're hard to miss.
that's right. And I have my bow tie on.
Can we all thank Nigel?
Thank you.